Okay, let's take a look at some examples. Go ahead and go to your Build a Module resource folder and copy the input directory. Go to your Sites base folder and paste input in Sites All Modules Custom. Okay, we have our folder here. This is a module called input. We've called it input to make it easier to identify the difference between the name of the module and the name of the functions, many of which have form in it. But this module is all about the form API in Drupal. And we have several files here. We have our input.module file, our input.info file, and our input.admin.inc, which we'll go into a little later. And then we have our steps directory. Go ahead and open up input.module, which should be blank, and open up the first step, which is called simple form. Go ahead and copy this code and paste it into your .module file and save it. Up to this point, we've basically been talking about forms as Drupal forms, but the forms in Drupal are built on the Form API, which is the name that's generally used for all of the functionality and ways that you can hook into forms and build forms in Drupal. So when I talk about the Form API, that's what it means. If you'd like a really good resource for all of the attributes and elements that can be used in forms, this URL is a great one to go to. If you don't know what those are, you'll learn about it as we go. So this file contains a very simple form example. It has two parts. In the first part, we define a page with our hook menu function. So we have a function here called input menu, and we're giving it a title of form API examples, a description, and the page callback is called Drupal get form. Now this is an internal Drupal function that's used to get a render array that represents a form. So we create a function, which is the second part down here, which returns that render array. The rest of the arguments here are the page arguments, which includes the name of the function that's going to get passed to Drupal get form, and this is a function that should include a render array for a form. And you see that that's the same name as the function we have down here. And then we're just defining access for this page. Let's go ahead and take a look at the function that returns the render array to Drupal get form. So you'll see inside of this function is some very simple code. We're taking a form array and we're adding two items to it, one called color and one called submit. And then we're returning that form. Now there's several attributes to this function that will be the same for every function that returns a render array to Drupal get form, one of which is the parameters that get passed to it. The first one is form, which as the form gets submitted and this function gets called again to rebuild the form, these items will get passed through that form variable up here. Form submit includes a variety of information, including the values that get submitted through the form when the form is submitted. And you'll notice that it's being passed as a reference, which you can tell by the ampersand at the beginning of the variable name, which means that any variations that we make to this variable during the course of the function will get added to it and passed to the parent function. For every item that we're defining here, we're defining a number of attributes. And you can tell which items are attributes by a hashtag that prefaces them. So this title is an attribute, type, required, and description are all attributes. And in our next example, we'll go ahead and look at something that has more of these attributes. But again, if you want to learn more about all of the attributes, this URL up here is a great one to go to. This should be pretty straightforward as you're looking at it. We're defining the title, which is actually a label that appears by default above the input. The type, which is the type of input, in this case it's a text field, which is the same as a text input, but this could be text area, checkboxes, radios, and a variety of others. Required allows us to perform some very simple validation on this to check to make sure that the input isn't empty when it's submitted. And description, which is a short description that will display below the input in smaller text. Our next item that we're adding is our submit button. So we're calling it submit, and we're giving it the type of submit, which is a submit button, and the value, which is the text that will display inside of the button. And finally, we're returning this. So all we're doing is defining the inputs that are going to be added to this form. We don't have to worry about defining where the form will be submitted or any of the additional information that we might be used to adding when we create forms in plain HTML. Nothing really will happen when we submit this, but let's go ahead and take a look at it in action. So the first thing we need to do is install our module. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here and select the Input Examples of Using the Form API module and click Save Configuration. Now I'm going to jump back to our code and we'll see this is the path that we're defining for our example. So I'm going to copy that path and paste it into the address bar of the browser. So this is what our form looks like when it gets rendered through Drupal. We have our label, we have an asterisk, a red asterisk that is added whenever the required attribute is added to an input. We have our input itself, and then we have a short description followed by the submit button. Now if I submit this, the basic validation that we added will run, and we'll get an error up here that says that the field is required. If we add some information and click submit, then it will pass. But because we haven't added any processing, nothing will actually happen. In this example, we're passing the form build array directly to the menu item. But if we wanted to add some additional information or code around our form, then we would want a separate function and we would want to embed the form inside of that function. So let's take a look at an example of that.